and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to turn the spotlight on the ongoing trade skirmishes, not between the US and China, but between US and India, which are of far greater relevance to us. Given the looming threat of US sanctions against India for actions ranging from purchase of Iranian oil to buying defense equipment from Russia, the question really boils down to how does one deal with a bully? And in a world where there's really nobody you can complain to. Yes, there is the World Trade Organization, the WTO, but for all practical purposes, the WTO has been reduced to virtually a paper tiger, much like the other multilateral organizations. Take the G20 for instance. The reality is that the US participates in multilateral negotiations only as long as it suits its own interests and serves its own purpose. Once that is done, it either walks out, as in the case of the climate change talks, or stalls, as with negotiations to the nominations to the WTO Dispute Settlement Forum. It's somewhat like the boy who owns a cricket bat and declares the game over the moment you declare him bowled. In such a scenario, how much elbow room does a country like India, an economic minnow, particularly in the global world trade, compared to the US, have? Joining me in discussion are two acknowledged experts in the trade arena. Abhijit Das, Head WTO Center at the Delhi-based Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and T.S. Vishwanath, Principal Advisor, APG SLG Law Offices. Welcome to the show, Abhijit, Vishy. US President Donald Trump recently described India as tariff king, accusing us of levying very high tariffs on US goods. So let me start by asking you whether that is a baseless allegation, given that our tariffs are well within the boundaries under the WTO, or is there some truth in what Trump says, because India often tops the charts of countries most frequently taken to the WTO Dispute Settlement Forum. Let me start with you, Abhijit.
Yes, our tariffs are comparatively higher compared to those in US and other developed countries, but this is an outcome of the negotiations during the Uruguay round. We paid elsewhere to get the right to retain high tariffs, and strictly speaking, US and President Trump should not be complaining on that score as long as we do not exceed our bound rates. And let's remind ourselves that it's President Trump and US which have exceeded the bound rates on flimsy grounds of national security.
Oh, absolutely, but very few will do the finger pointing at the US. That is the reality of geopolitics. Vishy, would you agree with Abhijit? And though the discussion is going to be more interesting when we disagree with each other maybe, I think you're likely to agree, even at the cost of making the debate a little boring. Vishy?
Yes, I do agree with Abhijit with the fact that India has high bound rates, but I think what we need to look at is what are the applied rates. And the applied rates actually are far, far lower. And as Abhijit just pointed out, we have not been, while we have been increasing tariffs on some of the issues and applied rates on some of the products of late, but the fact is we are nowhere close to the bound rates that we have very rightly got at the Uruguay round of negotiations. So therefore, naming us as tariff kings, I don't think is the right thing to do.
Though, of course, name calling is part of President Trump. You can't do anything about it. But Abhijit, the problem really is that this allegation about our tariffs and trade policies comes at a time when we have to raise our tariffs perhaps to keep the current account under control, as it is perilously close to crossing the danger mark of 2.5% of GDP. So does that in a way restrict the elbow room that we have and in the process imperil our macroeconomic stability, Abhijit?
Let's get one fact very clear. Even if we raise our tariffs within the bound rate, will it really have that much of an impact in curtailing the current account deficit?
Well, the government seems to think so.
Yes, but to that extent, I'm not sure, because I was reading empirical examination of this issue, and the overall conclusion was that, well, raising tariffs will really not help government overcome the current account deficit problem.
Yeah, that really is, I think, receive wisdom, but as I said, the government has its own views. Which the fact is that Trump says that India wants to have a trade deal with the US because it wants to keep him happy. Agreed, you can't afford to offend the president of the world's superpower, but surely we must ensure that his happiness doesn't come at the expense of 1.2 billion Indians. Or is it a given that the US always has an upper hand, as we've seen in the trade deals that the US has struck with Canada and with Mexico? So do we really have an option, Vishy?
Frankly, I think a trade deal is too far away an option, Mythili. I think what we first need to do is sort out the other trade issues that we have with the US. Okay. I think we need to understand where does India stand on issues such as GSP. I think we need to know where are we on some of the other areas which we're already in discussions with the US in terms of market access that India wants. It's not just about tariffs. Okay. I mean, the very fact that the US uses non-tariff barriers far more than it uses tariffs, is something I think we need to discuss. So I don't think we should jump into a trade deal with the US right away.
So the FTA with the US should not be on the cards at the moment.
It is. I don't think it should be, because all the FTAs that the US has had in the Trump regime, I don't think has been too beneficial for the countries who have negotiated with the US. So I think we should first try and sort out our differences with the US in terms of market access. We have a lot of issues with them. They supposedly have some issues with us. I think we should first sort that out before we move into anything called a trade deal.
But let's now turn to the new deal with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA that Trump says will be the template for future trade deals. How different are these from the erstwhile NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement between US, Mexico and Canada? How one-sided are they, Abhijit?
From Indian perspective, one of the key issues of worry should be the labor provision. Now, the possibility of getting duty-free access into the US is linked to the labor earning, I think it is $16 per hour. Certainly that is a cause of worry. If this becomes the norm, let's say, at the WTO, although at this juncture there is no such talk, but there is a push to get labor issues over there, then that will erode the comparative advantage of countries like India, where the labor costs are comparatively much lower than those in the developed world.
Yes,
so we have to be worried on that score, certainly. So that is one area where the USMCA differs from NAFTA. The second area is in terms of the value addition within the region for the auto sector. The value addition has been raised from 62.5 to about 70–75%. In other words, the incentive for Mexico and Canada to import parts and components from outside the region, let's say from China, Japan, Korea, that gets reduced.
So all this talk of global supply chains, etc., doesn't hold anymore? Is the US not concerned about that?
US is certainly concerned about that, but US is more interested in trying to get the manufacturing back into the country, and this is one way of doing it. Whether it will succeed, that's a separate question. And whether consumers will benefit or they will pay a higher price, again, that's an issue which needs to be debated.
And the US doesn't seem to be willing to look at it at the moment, certainly. That would seem to be the position, right?
Yes, at this juncture, they are just looking at getting jobs back.
At whatever price maybe, but let's see how it works. But Vishy, is it inevitable really that in any bilateral deal with the US, given that it has a much larger economic clout, will it always be one-sided? The US administration says the USMCA will pave the way for securing fair and reciprocal market access on America's terms, not realizing how absurd that sounds. Fair and reciprocal, but on America's terms, what does that mean, Vishy? There's a contradiction in the statement itself.
I don't think any deal with the US can be fair and reciprocal. I think there is always this feeling with the US that whenever the US comes on the table, it expects a lot more from the other country than what it is actually willing to give.
And it's in a position to dictate.
And it is nearly always in a position to dictate what it seriously wants, for the simple reason that we may also not be in a position to think the whole process through. For instance, I think even some of the other FTAs, for instance, I think if we had thought the process through of how kind of a value chain we would really want to build, and what is it that we need from the other country, it might have helped us a lot more. But in a country like the US, where I think the difference between India as a developing country and the US as a developed country is going to be far very different from what it would be between two developing countries. So I seriously don't think we should look at an FTA right now. If you're talking about reciprocal benefits, let's start looking at what is useful for us, what is good for us, and seek that from the US rather than try and get into an FTA with them.
Yeah, it really would be extremely premature, I would think, to get into an FTA. Apachit, the USMCA, though a tentative agreement, will replace a long-standing NAFTA agreement with new rules for things like patent protection for drugs. You talk about labor standards, then complex rules of origin determining national source of a product, of auto, and labor and environmental standards. Of these, the latter two, labor and environmental standards, are something that we've been resisting, including in the WTO all along. So what is the way forward? Will we really be able to, even if we don't negotiate a WTO, an agreement with the US, a bilateral trade agreement, will we be able to keep it out of WTO, assuming the WTO still continues?
Mythili, the answer to your question will depend on whether we are able to convince other developing countries of the dangerous effects if labor and environment get into the WTO. If we are able to build a coalition, then we will succeed in keeping these issues out. But if we are unable to build a coalition, if we are unable to convince other countries of the severe adverse impact of getting labor and environment within the WTO, then I'm afraid we will have to fight an uphill battle.
And how successful have we been in the past of, getting other countries to join us, talk about South-South coalition, etc.? Has it really worked in the past?
Certainly on the issue of labor, it has worked. We managed to keep out labor in the Doha Declaration, although environment did creep in. But now there's a greater realization that linking environment with trade agreements may not be the best option. But let's also bear in mind that US itself is
not interested in environment.
Is not interested in environment any longer. And I understand that a few developing countries are likely to be junking the Paris deal as well. So the commitment of US and a few developing countries to environment, that might be weakening now.
The commitment of the US, and along with that many developing countries which cannot afford to say no to the US, I think it's weakening all along. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with T.S. Vishwanath and Abhijit on what is the future for Indo-US trade relations, given the way the US has acted with its own allies. In fact, Vishy, before the break we were talking about how the US has arm-twisted allies. So the question really is that do we have any wiggle room at all, given that the US has scant respect for WTO, and the new deals incorporate deals, on some 21st century issues like digital trade, where we really don't have a domestic framework as yet. Is it a victory for American companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, particularly comes at a time when we have not framed our own rules for e-commerce and issues like localization of servers, which the RBI has been insisting on in the case of payments data? There's an enormous pressure that they should not be forced to do it. So what is the way forward really for us in these new areas?
I think in these new areas, we seriously need to sit together and also bring in all the players who are already there in the market and have a huge discussion on what should be the policy that we need to take. But before that, I just wanted to add to what Abhijit said when he talked about allies, and you talked about the whole concept of in WTO and what are the kind of allies we have. I think one change that has happened in the recent past is the kind of allies that we had and the kind of friends that we had in the WTO seems to be slipping.
Why is that so?
I now find that when we're talking in the WTO, a lot of countries which were working with India, now they're going on. They are going along with either China on issues such as e-commerce. You find many of the countries who are with us are actually moving to the other side on issues such as investment. We have a lot of African countries talking about other issues. So I think we now need to choose our allies very carefully in terms of who we. So is that a reflection
of the decreasing importance of the WTO, or is it a new geopolitical?
I think it is the new geopolitical wave that is now growing, and I think we need to be aware of that to begin with. The second thing I think about the question that you asked about what do we do with the new issues. I don't think we seriously have given it a thought, a much serious thought from a national perspective. I think we have just picked and chosen a few areas and we have kind of responded to it. We do not have a large umbrella policy on some of the new issues which are coming up. So I think we seriously as a country, we need to start looking at larger policies which will impact the new economy, digital, e-commerce and everything that we are talking about. And I think ministries need to sit together, and I would seriously believe that something like this has to be taken up at a much higher level, maybe at the Prime Minister's level or something like that, where all the ministries are brought together and we talk about a larger policy on new and emerging issues.
Because October 15th was the deadline for localization of your payment servers, and we've seen large card companies, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they haven't fallen in line and they're bringing enormous pressure on India. So will it be possible for us to negotiate each of these separately, or we need an uniform umbrella?
I would think that we need an umbrella thing, but instead of going specifically, because then you may have a lot of places where you may not be able to find solutions for some of the larger issues. I think we need a big picture, and then we need to look at verticals within that big picture in terms of working on it.
Obviously, turning to the current account deficit, the US is determined to wipe out its 25 billion trade deficit with India. And apart from tariffs on Indian merchandise exports, has also been tightening their screws when it comes to our services exports by putting restrictions on things like visas. Given that services exports, in fact, is so important for us, what really is the future for services trade?
I would say very uncertain at this juncture, given the present climate in the US, which links our services exports with immigration and visa issues. So I think there is a fair bit of uncertainty, and US is using this uncertainty as a weapon, as a negotiating leverage. So we really need to get our act together domestically
So what do we do for services exports? In the case of, merchandise exports, we can do ease of doing business, we need to improve things like that. But in the case of services exports, where we're entirely dependent on what the US does in terms of visas, what can we really do to improve our strength or bargaining power?
Very difficult, Mythili. It cannot be done overnight.
Okay.
The IT industry should have got its act together over the past 15, 20 years when it was booming. It has not diversified adequately from the US market. It has not got into making digital products. It relies more on back office processing. And so to that extent, part of the blame really lies on ourselves. We have, to a certain extent, brought the problem on our doorsteps.
That unfortunately is true of so many issues as far as India is concerned. But Rishi, the fact is that the US has been warning other countries against signing any free trade pact with what it calls non-market economies, essentially China, in order to prevent cheap Chinese goods from entering through third countries. But India is in the midst of negotiating join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership RCEP, a free trade agreement covering China and the 10 members of the ASEAN. So what does this mean for us now? Does it mean that it's a death knell for RCEP really?
No, I don't think that it's a death knell for RCEP. I think the RCEP is something which would certainly will get pushed by the countries within the ASEAN and a lot
the
of
US
other
will
countries.
not take askance?
I don't think that the US would take askance on RCEP. What I think it would take askance on is the fact that if India goes ahead with negotiations on RCEP and does not talk about market access with the US, is when there could be some kind of an issue. But I think there's the other issue which is on services. I think that's where I think in terms of when we're talking about FTAs, one thing which we seriously need to do is to start skilling people a lot more. I think the Niti Aayog needs to start getting into a lot more discussions in terms of how do we diversify from IT and what can we do, because I think what we seriously lack in terms of services exports is that there is a lack of skill. There is a lack of education. I think there are not enough people who are coming out from schools and colleges who can start and join the services sector.
But how would that take care of the problem of visas? Because the US is not going to give visas for IT professionals, they would not give it for a care economy.
I seriously think if we can do that, then we can move away from our dependence on asking only about the visas. And I think we can start getting into other areas of services from mode 1 to mode 4 as we talk about in the services negotiations. And I think we can move away from our dependence completely on mode 4 where we're talking about visas and moving ahead. And for that, I think we need a much bigger policy, and I think someone like a Niti Aayog should work with the Ministry of Commerce very closely to try and bring out something in terms of skilling and benefiting our services.
A larger pool of skilled persons,
who can enter into new areas of services. I think we are over-dependent on IT and we are over-dependent on some of the specific sectors for our services.
So there the US would not prevent Indians from going.
So then if your dependence on mode 4 goes away, I know it is not something which can get done tomorrow, but I think we should at least start planning now so that we can start looking at a greater role services can play within our economy and also in our exports.
That's true. And with the aging of populations in the West, I think this is going to be a huge demand for care workers particularly, which we have not really cashed in on. Philippines, in fact, has a huge number of people going in for.
I think one of the best ways to stop US from, trying to bully us, arm twisting us or bullying us, is to kind of ensure that we're not over-dependent on them on anything that we are doing in terms of global thing.
Abhijit, what is the future really of TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights? Because WTO rules give members like India the right to make our own rules on price control, compulsory licensing of drugs, etc. But Trump has strengthened the rules for intellectual property rights, IPR, in the USMCA to improve the profitability of his drug and entertainment industries. If he demands tighter IPR regulations, particularly in the matter of drugs, what does it mean for India? Because we've been introducing things like price control on stents, etc. So that will not be possible anymore. So even if the US doesn't insist on a US-India bilateral, in the interim they could do things like that.
US has been very systematically, very persistently attacking India on its IP rules. Our stand rightly has been that our IP domestic rules are fully compliant with the WTO obligations. The gap in perception is we are making use of the flexibilities which exist in the TRIPS agreement. US wants to cut down on those flexibilities. It has tried its best in the past. India has managed to resist this pressure for the very simple reason that if we cave into the US pressure and end up tightening the IPR rules the way US wants, the impact will be felt by the common man. The drug prices in the country will really shoot up. affordable medicine may really not remain affordable. Costs of healthcare will really go up, and it will burn a hole in the budget of families of sick people. So I think this has the potential of creating a grave crisis within the country if we are to give in to the demands of US on IP rules. So the government has very correctly stood firm in resisting the US efforts at getting India to reduce its flexibilities and to strengthen its IP protection. And I think that's the way forward as well.
But we could do it in the past when, you know, the US was still willing to go along with WTO, at least on paper. But now under the new regime in the US, will we be really able to stand firm? And because we no longer have the umbrella of the WTO, at least for all practical purposes. So will we be able to stand firm?
The onus is on us to stand firm.
Okay.
It is not for the WTO to protect us. We have to stand firm, and it has to be a national decision taken at a fairly high level.
And the cost, you feel, will not be too high?
The trade-off really is that, are we willing to let prices of medicines escalate in the country in order to just keep US happy? I think the answer is absolutely obvious. For us, we have no choice. We have to make sure that our generic industry continues to thrive and does not get threatened or does not get whittled away through patented drugs, which will happen if we ratchet up, if we strengthen our IP protection laws.
True. I think a lot of things we really have to be tested, and the world is too scared to really call the US's bluff. That really is a problem. But Rishi, will India be a net gainer from Trump's attempts to cut China down? Or will it be like, you know, when two elephants are fighting, the grass is what gets trampled on? So will India suffer the collateral damage of Trump's attempts to really cut China to size?
You know, Mythili, actually, I have a problem with us thinking that we should gain from a US-China trade war. I think India should be in a position where it has its own place in terms of international trade. While these small gains would certainly benefit us, but I think what we seriously need is to have a policy by which we can increase our exports into China and be a lot more linked and have a greater footprint across the globe. One thing which we have to do for that is to start building value chains, which we have seriously not worked on.
But there is the view that we're already out of the global value chain and now we cannot possibly claw back in.
No,
is that correct?
We can certainly do that, especially with what the US is doing in terms of the trade war. Now, what you're saying is that many countries are realizing that, you know, having over-dependence on China,
the Southeast Asian countries
and the others is not going to work. So therefore, it might be really worthwhile for some of the large firms and especially the medium-sized firms in India to start seeing, can they become part of a value chain. Once you become part of a value chain, then you will have sustainable exports and we'll have a far better and a sustainable export policy than what we have done now.
So we have not missed the bus completely?
I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think this is actually the right time for us to start relooking at what are the value chains we need to develop. And that's the reason why I also talked about the services skilling and others, because services will be a very important component of building those value chains. And I think we need a far more comprehensive policy in terms of our exports of goods and services, especially looking at it from a value chain. Then we can certainly benefit from the FTAs that are existing, from the RCEP if it comes through. And also just the fact that we will not be over dependent on one or two markets for our exports.
Obviously, the US officials really see India as a credible long-term check on Chinese power in Asia, and in fact have been urging Trump to treat India a little more leniently. But can one expect better treatment from a president who has been very kind to his own allies? So will the US look kindly on our buying defense equipment from Russia, the fact that we might like to do a deal with Iran on oil? Do you think that the US will look at India a little bit more kindly? Because particularly in the case of oil, it has immediate implications for India.
Mythili, in the global scenario, each country looks after its own interest. No country treats any other country with kid glove. And we should be prepared to live with that situation where US will play hardball. We have to be adequately in a position to respond to that hardball treatment.
Okay, so in the David versus Goliath, you think it is possible for a David to look Goliath in the eye?
Let's not miss the fact that US is certainly huge, but we are also a big market. We are a big emerging market whose growth potential is enormous. We might not be the size of US, but the growth potential is something which we must be cognizant of, we must leverage.
Okay, I'm entirely with you on that, but I really don't know how far, we really can do it. In fact, Vishy, let me ask you the same question. Are we really skating on thin ice with our purchase of the defense equipment from Russia and, of course, brave talk of buying oil from Iran after Trump's deadline of November 4th kicks in? So are we really, as I said, pushing our luck on the issue?
I don't think we're pushing our luck on this issue. I think there is enough of past where we have managed to do this. I think what we see.
But we had a different man in the White House.
We had a different man in the White House now, and but the fact is that man also needs allies outside. He can't keep upsetting all the allies that he has outside. We are certainly not an ally, but certainly a friend.
Yeah.
And therefore the fact is that and he was not as close as even Canada, and he has been far more
far brutal
with Canada than he has been with us. But the fact is that I think we also need to sometimes take decisions which are in the larger interest and not just be one concerned about the fact is how is one country going to respond to us on any.
Well, I'm afraid we ran out of time completely, so I'll have to end this discussion now. The IMF has already warned of how trade deals are going to impact GDP growth in the world, and we also have news that the WTO itself might be undergoing some reform so that we have the one democratic institution, the multilateral institution, going the way of the IMF and the World Bank. And that's not good news at all for India. But thank you very much, Vishy and Abhijit, for joining me in this discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.